I am staring at the digital clock on the main security console, watching the glowing green numbers flip from 2:14 to 2:15 in the morning, while holding a folded piece of paper that proves the woman my son married is actively trying to erase my existence. I am going to share something with you that I have kept buried under layers of shame and silent endurance for the past 2 years, because there is a specific kind of poison that looks like polite concern, and if I do not speak about it, it will consume me entirely. Before I pull back the curtain on the darkest chapter of my family life, I want you to drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you are listening from, because knowing that real people are out there in the world listening makes this cold night inside the guardhouse feel a little less isolating. My name is Margaret. I am 68 years old, and I wear a heavy navy blue security uniform with a silver badge that pulls at the fabric of my chest pocket. I work the night shift at a high-end corporate archive facility on the outskirts of Boston, a job I took not because I am greedy, but because I wanted to remain fiercely independent after my husband passed away, and because the quiet hours suit a mind that has too much to think about. I raised my son David in a small, sturdy house with a wraparound porch that I paid off completely 3 years ago. David was a gentle boy, the kind who would carefully carry spiders outside in a paper cup rather than crush them. And he grew into a man who designed software for medical equipment. He is successful, he is kind, and he is entirely blind to the slow, suffocating manipulation of his wife, Clara. Clara is 32 years old, and she possesses a terrifying kind of elegance. When David first brought her to my house for Sunday dinner, she walked through my front door wearing a tailored beige coat and carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She smiled at me, a perfect, symmetrical expression that involved her mouth but never quite reached the temperature of her eyes. She called me Margaret instead of Mrs. Hayes, and within the first 10 minutes of sitting at my dining table, she managed to compliment my home in a way that made it sound like an apology. She said it was so charmingly rustic, so wonderfully preserved from a bygone era, effectively turning my life's work into a quaint museum exhibit. I pushed down the discomfort. I told myself I was being a protective mother, jealous of the beautiful young woman who had captured my son's attention. I scolded myself for my suspicions. I attended their wedding. I wore the pastel dress Clara selected for me, and I smiled for the photographs while she gently repositioned my shoulders to ensure I did not ruin the aesthetic of the frame. The nightmare did not begin with a loud argument or a dramatic slamming of doors. It began like water seeping into a foundation, silent and ruinous. Clara wanted my house. More specifically, she wanted the financial equity tied into my house to fund a lifestyle that David's salary alone could not comfortably support. And she wanted me removed from the equation of their lives. She did not ask me for money. That would be too coarse for Clara. Instead, she began a meticulous campaign to convince my son, and eventually me, that my mind was failing, that I was a danger to myself, and that I needed to be placed in an assisted living facility where she would hold the power of attorney. The first entirely new scene of this quiet war happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing the delicate floral teacups that had belonged to my grandmother, preparing for David and Clara's weekly visit. I heard the front door chime and David's familiar, heavy footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sharp, rhythmic click of Clara's heels. I dried my hands on a cotton towel and walked into the living room to greet them. Clara was standing near the fireplace, holding a small, decorative brass clock that usually sat on the mantel. She turned to me with a look of deep, practiced sorrow. "Margaret," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, pitying register, "we were just talking about how exhausted you have been looking lately. Working those night shifts at your age, it really is not safe." I stood my ground, keeping my posture straight. "I enjoy my work, Clara. It keeps me active, and the archives are very peaceful." She sighed, placing the brass clock down on a side table instead of back on the mantel, a small, deliberate act of displacing my reality. "But Margaret, you are forgetting things. David told me you lost your spare set of keys last week." I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. I had misplaced my keys, yes, but I had found them exactly where I left them, inside the pocket of my heavy winter coat. I looked at David, who was staring at the floor, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Mom," David started, rubbing the back of his neck, "Clara is just worried. You know, with the stairs in this house and your strange sleeping schedule. Maybe it is time we start looking at places that offer a little more support. A place on one level. We could handle the sale of this house for you. You would not have to worry about a single piece of paperwork." I looked from my son's earnest, worried face to Clara's perfectly composed features. She was looking at me with absolute triumph, masked as familial devotion. I did not raise my voice. I walked over to the side table, picked up the brass clock, and placed it exactly where it belonged on the mantel. "I am not selling my home," I said clearly, "and my memory is perfectly fine." We sat down for tea, and for the next hour Clara spoke over me, answered questions directed at me before I could open my mouth, and subtly redirected every conversation to the topic of cognitive decline in the elderly. I watched my son nod along, the seeds of doubt taking root in his mind, exactly as she intended. The second scene unfolded exactly 2 weeks later, and it was the moment I realized I was not just dealing with an overbearing daughter-in-law, but with someone actively orchestrating my downfall. It was a Saturday morning. I had just returned from a long Friday night shift at the archive facility. My legs ached, and my eyes were dry from staring at the security monitors. I unlocked my front door and immediately smelled gas. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped my canvas tote bag on the floor and rushed into the kitchen. All 4 burners on my antique gas stove were turned slightly, just enough to release the silent, deadly hiss of natural gas into the room without igniting. I threw open the kitchen windows, coughing as the cold autumn air rushed in, and twisted the dials to the off position. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the plastic knobs. I leaned against the counter, trying to draw clean air into my lungs. I have cooked on that stove for 40 years. I have never, not once, left a burner open. As the kitchen aired out, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Clara's number. I answered it, holding the phone away from my ear as if it might burn me. "Margaret, dear," Clara's voice flowed smoothly through the speaker. "David and I are just driving back from the farmer's market. We wanted to drop off some fresh vegetables for you. We are about 5 minutes away." She had timed it perfectly. She had a spare key to my house, given to David years ago for emergencies. She had come in while I was at the end of my shift, turned on the gas, and left, timing her arrival with David so that he would walk in, smell the gas, and find his mother sitting in a lethal environment she supposedly created herself. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I forced my breathing to slow down. I walked to the front door, picked up my tote bag, and waited on the porch in the freezing air. When their car pulled into the driveway, David jumped out, holding a brown paper bag of groceries. Clara emerged slowly, her eyes scanning my face, looking for confusion or panic. I did not give her either. "I locked myself out," I said to David, my voice remarkably steady. "I am waiting for the locksmith. I think there is an issue with the kitchen stove, David. You might want to have a professional look at it. The pilot light seems to be malfunctioning and leaking gas." I smelled it from the porch. Clara's expression froze for a fraction of a second, a tiny microscopic crack in her porcelain facade. She recovered instantly, rushing forward to place a hand on my arm. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed. "You must be terrified." "David, this is exactly what I was talking about. She cannot manage this old house anymore. It is a death trap." I looked directly into Clara's eyes. "The stove is broken, Clara. My mind is not." The tension between us was a physical weight in the cold air. David, completely missing the silent war being waged in front of him, promised to call a repairman and suggested I stay with them for the weekend. I refused. I stayed in a local motel that night, paying with cash, because I knew I could no longer sleep safely under my own roof if Clara had access to it. The following Monday, I changed the locks. I did not tell David. I let him discover it the next time he came over. Clara played the victim beautifully, weeping to David about how I was shutting them out, how my paranoia was a clear symptom of dementia. The third new scene is where the absolute core of her treachery revealed itself. It was deep winter now, January, and the nights at the corporate archive were long and brutally cold. The facility I guard houses physical records for pharmaceutical companies and financial institutions. It is a fortress of paper and hard drives. I have a strict patrol route. I walk the long, sterile corridors with a heavy flashlight, scanning security badges against electronic checkpoints. I know the rhythm of the building. I know which cameras have a 3-second delay, and I know the exact blind spot near the loading dock doors where the service elevator meets the exterior brick wall. At 3 a.m. on a Thursday, I was sitting in the main guard booth, drinking black coffee, when a sleek black sedan pulled into the visitor parking lot. The facility was closed. No one was authorized to be on site. I zoomed in the exterior camera. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out into the snow. It was Clara. She was wearing a heavy dark coat and carrying a thick leather briefcase. My blood turned to ice water. Why was my daughter-in-law, a marketing consultant for a real estate firm, arriving at a secure corporate archive in the middle of the night? I watched as she approached the secondary entrance, the one reserved for executive badge holders. She pulled a lanyard from her pocket and swiped a card. The light on the scanner flashed green. The door unlocked. She had high-level clearance. I immediately opened the security log interface on my computer. I typed in the identification number that had just flashed on my screen. The badge was registered to a shell corporation, a vendor account approved for emergency data retrieval. I watched Clara on the internal monitors. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking silently on the screens, straight toward Sector 4. Sector 4 held financial disclosure records. I did not confront her. I knew that if I stepped out and asked her what she was doing, she would spin a lie so dense and perfect that I would end up looking like a confused old woman hallucinating her family members at work. Instead, I did what a security guard does. I observed. I watched her enter the document room, spend 12 minutes inside, and exit with a thick manila envelope stuffed into her briefcase. She left the building, got into her car, and drove away. The next morning, when my shift ended, I did not go home. I went to the public library. I used the computers there to search the name of the shell corporation tied to her badge. It took me 4 hours of digging through public records and business registries, but I found the thread. Clara was not just trying to put me in a home to get my house. Clara was drowning in massive, unrecoverable debt from illegal offshore investments. She had been embezzling money from her own real estate firm, using David's clean credit to secure bridge loans without his knowledge. The records she was stealing from the archive were the paper trails connecting her vendor accounts to the pharmaceutical company's real estate acquisitions. She was destroying evidence. And my house, my life savings, my trust fund, were the exact amount she needed to liquidate to cover the missing funds before the annual corporate audit in March. To get that money, she needed David to have full control of my assets. And to get David to have full control, she needed me declared legally incompetent. The psychological pressure escalated from passive aggression to active sabotage. Clara began mailing strange packages to my house under my name, subscriptions to adult incontinence products I did not need, brochures for memory care facilities, letters from psychiatric clinics thanking me for my inquiries. She was building a paper trail of my supposed decline. She would casually leave these envelopes on the kitchen counter when they visited, waiting for David to find them. David became increasingly distant. The warmth in his voice when he called me was replaced by a tight, strained anxiety. He spoke to me slowly, using simple words, the way one speaks to a frightened child. Every time I tried to tell him about Clara, about the gas stove, about the strange mail, he would shake his head, his eyes full of tears, and beg me to see a doctor. Clara had isolated me from the only person I loved in this world, without ever raising a finger. The climax of her plan, the moment she decided to execute her final strike, happened during a brutal snowstorm in February. I was at work. The archive facility was locked down. The roads were treacherous. At 1 a.m, the heavy secure door to the guard booth buzzed. I looked at the monitor. Clara was standing outside in the freezing wind, holding a thermos and wrapped in a thick scarf. I hesitated, but policy required me to investigate anyone at the perimeter. I unlocked the heavy glass door, but kept the security chain engaged. "Clara, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice cold and flat. She smiled, her teeth chattering slightly. "Oh, Margaret, David was so worried about you driving in this storm. He asked me to bring you some hot soup and check on you. Please, let me in for just a minute. I am freezing." I knew David had not asked her to do this. David was at a conference in Chicago. I knew this because he had called me from the airport 2 days ago. Clara was lying. She was standing in the snow, performing a role, and I knew she was about to spring a trap. I unhooked the chain and let her step into the small vestibule of the guard booth. She stamped the snow off her boots and placed the thermos on my security console. "It is so lonely out here," she said, her eyes darting across the array of monitors, noting the exact position of the cameras. She reached into her coat pocket. "I have some new photos of David from the conference I wanted to show you." As she stepped closer to me, pretending to search for her phone, she deliberately bumped into the small table where I kept my canvas tote bag. The bag tipped over. "Oh, I am so clumsy," she gasped, kneeling down quickly to gather my things. I watched her hands. I watched her with the hyper-focus of a woman fighting for her life. I saw her slide a small metallic silver hard drive from her sleeve and drop it directly into the bottom of my bag, covering it with my knitting yarn. She stood up, brushing her knees. "Anyway, I should get back before the roads get worse. Enjoy the soup, Margaret. Take care of yourself." She turned and walked out into the storm. I stood in the quiet booth, listening to the wind. I knew exactly what that silver drive was. It was a restricted, encrypted master drive from Sector 4. If a guard is caught with a restricted master drive off the premises, it is an automatic federal felony charge for corporate espionage and theft. Clara was going to call the facility manager anonymously as soon as she drove away. She was going to report suspicious activity. The police would arrive, they would search my bag, they would find the stolen drive, and Margaret Hayes, the confused, elderly woman with a history of strange behavior, would be arrested. David would be devastated. Clara would smoothly step in, declare me unfit to stand trial due to severe dementia, take emergency power of attorney, liquidate my assets to pay for my defense and care, and secretly cover her own embezzlement tracks. It was a perfect, merciless execution. But Clara made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed I was exactly what she told everyone I was, a slow, tired old woman. I did not panic. I reached into my bag and pulled out the silver drive. It was heavy, cold metal. I had less than 10 minutes before the local police, tipped off by her anonymous call, would arrive at the gates. I could not simply throw it in the trash. They would search the booth. I could not put it back in Sector 4. I did not have the clearance codes to open the vault. I looked at the security monitors. I thought about the blind spot near the loading dock, the one camera that had a 3-second delay. I grabbed my flashlight and the drive, stepped out of the booth, and walked briskly through the snow toward the rear of the building. The cold bit into my face. I reached the loading dock. I timed my movements with the sweeping red light of the exterior camera. 1, 2, 3. I stepped into the shadow of the brick pillar. I knelt down by the heavy steel drainage grate near the foundation. I slipped the silver drive through the metal slats. It dropped silently into the dark, freezing water of the storm drain below, entirely irretrievable without heavy excavation equipment, and completely disconnected from me. I walked back to the guard booth, sat down in my chair, and waited. 12 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the gates, lights flashing through the falling snow. Behind them was the facility manager's SUV. They demanded entry. They demanded to search my person and my belongings based on a credible, anonymous tip of corporate theft. I complied with absolute calm. I stood with my hands in my pockets while they tore through my tote bag, emptied my thermos of the soup Clara brought, and patted down my uniform. They found nothing. The facility manager, a stern man named Mr. Arris, looked confused and embarrassed. "Margaret, I am so sorry," he stammered. "The caller was very specific. They said you had a master drive in your bag." I looked at him, and then I looked at the police officers. "Sir," I said quietly, "may I ask who made the call?" "It was an anonymous female," the officer replied. I nodded slowly. "Sir, if you pull up the exterior camera footage from 20 minutes ago, you will see my daughter-in-law, Clara Hayes, arriving at this booth. She insisted on bringing me soup. I believe she may have been confused about her surroundings. She has been under a lot of stress lately." The police reviewed the footage. They saw Clara enter, bump my bag, and leave. Because there was no stolen property found, there was no crime to charge me with. But the facility manager saw the footage of an unauthorized civilian accessing a secure perimeter. The next morning, I did not go to sleep. I called a lawyer, a sharp, aggressive woman I had researched weeks ago. We sat in her office, and I laid out the security logs showing Clara's late-night visits with the Shell Corporation badge. I laid out the public records of her debt. I laid out the timeline of the gas leak and the fake psychiatric mail. My lawyer contacted the fraud department of the pharmaceutical company whose records Clara had been destroying. Corporate auditors move much faster than local police when millions of dollars are at stake. Within 48 hours, Clara's entire world collapsed. The auditors discovered the missing funds. They discovered the forged bridge loans attached to David's name. They discovered the Shell Corporation. The confrontation did not happen in a courtroom, not at first. It happened in my living room. David came over on a Sunday evening. He looked terrible. His eyes were red, his clothes were wrinkled. Clara was with him, but she did not look elegant anymore. She looked like a cornered animal. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and the polite smile was gone, replaced by a tight, white-lipped grimace. David sat on my sofa and put his face in his hands. "Mom," he choked out, "the bank called me. The police were at Clara's office yesterday. I do not understand what is happening. She says it is a mistake. She says someone framed her." I stood by the fireplace, my hand resting gently on the brass clock she had tried to move months ago. I looked at the woman who had tried to slowly, methodically bury me alive. Clara stared back at me, and in her eyes there was no longer any pretense. There was only pure, unadulterated hatred. She hated me because I survived. She hated me because I did not quietly fade away into the shadows she had prepared for me. "Clara is going to prison, David," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "She has stolen millions of dollars, and when she could not hide it any more, she tried to convince you that I was losing my mind, so she could steal my home to pay her debts." Clara stood up, her hands clenching into fists. "You crazy old bat," she hissed, her carefully cultivated voice finally breaking into something ugly and shrill. "You have always hated me. You planned this. You set me up." I did not raise my voice. I did not move. "Clara," I replied, "the only thing I planned was surviving you, and I did." David looked up at his wife, listening to the venom in her voice, a tone he had never heard before. In that moment, the illusion shattered. He saw the stranger he had married. He saw the coldness that I had felt since the day she walked through my door. The divorce proceedings are ongoing, alongside the federal indictment against Clara for wire fraud and corporate espionage. She is currently out on bail, living in a cheap apartment across town, stripped of her designer clothes and her corporate title. David moved back into his childhood bedroom for a few months. It has been a quiet, painful process of rebuilding our relationship. We sit on the porch in the evenings, and he apologizes over and over for not believing me, for letting her convince him that my mind was failing. I forgive him because he is my son, and because I know how powerful the illusion of love can be when it is wielded by a sociopath. I still work the night shift at the archive. I still wear the heavy navy blue uniform. The silence of the facility does not feel lonely anymore. It feels like victory. It feels like the peace you earn when you walk through a fire and come out on the other side holding the truth. If you have someone in your life who smiles at you while slowly dismantling your confidence, if you have a family member who constantly makes you feel like you are misremembering reality, do not ignore it. The feeling of being erased is not a misunderstanding. It is an attack. Trust your memory. Trust your instincts. Document everything, and never let anyone convince you that you are losing your mind just because they are afraid of what you know. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to deal with a master manipulator in your own family? And how did you finally break their hold? Do not forget to subscribe to the channel because the truth deserves to be heard, even when it is hidden in the dark.